There are some epic David versus Goliath battles in history, and today we'll explore the bravery of Commander Ernest E. Evans. He was a World War II hero that boldly led a small fleet of U.S. ships against a massive Japanese fleet that included one of the most terrifying vessels in history. Ernest Evans was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1908 and was a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. During his formative years, he lived with his mother and sister. Evans faced prejudices growing up, but he worked hard and graduated from high school. After that, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. His initial plan was to join the Marine Corps, but he injured his knee in high school. So Evans was appointed to join the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He then graduated as an ensign in 1931, and while he was in the Navy, he was nicknamed Chief. Before World War II, Evans was assigned to various ships. When the U.S. entered the war, he was serving on the USS Alden, and by 1944, he was commander of the USS Johnston. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer that was built in Seattle in 1942. Military historians have noted that the Johnston and similar Fletcher-type destroyers were vital pieces to the U.S. Navy fleet that served during World War II. They were known for being quick and were able to take a great deal of damage from other ships during battle. The ship was named after John Vincent Johnston, a commander of a gunboat during the Civil War. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, who served for Evans, apparently had this to say about him. "I can see him now. Short, barrel-chested, standing on the bridge with his hands on his hips." He then said that Evans would give out a running fire of orders in a bull-like voice. It's said that during the commissioning of the Johnston, Evans stated that the vessel was going to be a fighting ship and that he intended to go into harm's way. He then gave the appointed crew the option of getting off the ship if they didn't want to go along with his sometimes risky orders. War in the Pacific. In January and February of 1944, the Johnston was involved in the bombardment of the Japanese at the Marshall Islands and provided support for U.S. troops. And there was similar success in July of that same year when the Johnston was sent to the Solomon Islands. Evans' bravery shined bright on May 16, 1944, when his ship encountered a Japanese submarine. He managed to successfully maneuver the Johnston and dropped depth charges against the enemy sub. The attack resulted in the destruction of the submarine, but all that was visible to the crew of the Johnston was an oil slick. The Johnston's crew also reported hearing a heavy underwater ripple explosion, coupled with the appearance of debris along the surface of the water. This earned Evans the Bronze Star, an award for heroic achievement, and the award citation praised him for quickly regaining contact with the submarine. The Johnston would go on to join the USS Pennsylvania in July 1944 to bombard Japanese defenses in Guam. And by the end of that month, the Johnston had fired some 4,000 shells. Reclaiming the Philippines. 5 months after his success against a Japanese submarine, Evans and the Johnston had a new mission in the Pacific. They were part of an operation to reclaim the Philippines from Japanese control. The United States had gained control of the Philippines in 1898, following the Spanish-American War. And it was December 1941 when the Japanese launched an assault on the Philippines, which surprised the Filipinos and the American military stationed on the island. By 1944, the U.S. and Great Britain were successful in their island-hopping campaign in the Pacific to weaken the grip Japan had on the Pacific. And the Philippines was key in this campaign. If the Allied forces could claim the island, then they could cut off the Japanese supply lines. The Philippines would be an excellent location for Allied forces to launch missions against Japanese-controlled islands in the area. The waterlocked country was also a point where the Allies could begin their invasion of the island of Formosa, later known as Taiwan. The powers that be weren't certain if the Philippines should be taken by force or if the plans for an invasion should be shelved. It was General Douglas MacArthur who decided on an invasion. MacArthur had fought valiantly against the Japanese in the Philippines in 1942 and vowed that he'd return. It was September 1944 when attacks against the Japanese in the Philippines were launched. Bombing missions by the Allies were also launched, and October 1944 saw fighting on Leyte, an island that's part of the Philippines. And on October 20th, to be exact, an amphibious assault was launched by the Allies on Leyte. The Japanese devised a masterful plan known as Shogo. which was also referred to as Operation Victory. Their strategy aimed to divert the U.S. ships north of the island of Leyte, while deploying a powerful fleet of Japanese ships to disrupt the ongoing assault on the island within the Leyte Gulf. Shogo commenced on a promising note as the Japanese successfully diverted the U.S. fleet to the north, creating an opportunity for their battle-hardened ships to advance into the Leyte Gulf and potentially alter the course of the conflict. In that Japanese fleet were 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. And the star of that fleet was the feared Yamato. At 863 feet, 263 meters, the Yamato was one of the biggest battleships in naval history. It was armed with massive guns to intimidate the enemy, and the anti-aircraft guns on the ship were incredibly nasty. When fired, a timed fuse in the shell would be triggered. The shell would then explode in the airspace, filling it with burning steel and shrapnel. Additionally, the Yamato was heavily armored. Those that sailed on the Yamato claimed that the ship didn't have any pitch or roll due to its armor. Sailors felt as if they were standing on firm ground while at sea on the vessel. Also, the ship could move at 27 knots, or roughly 31 miles per hour, 50 kilometers per hour. In 1942, the Yamato became the flagship for the combined fleet under the command of Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. But on Christmas Day in 1943, the submarine USS Skate, which was patrolling the waters off Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, successfully fired a torpedo at the Yamato and did some damage. It was down but not out. So, after repairs, the Yamato went into action in the Philippines under the command of Admiral Takeo Kurita. It would be Kurita that would lead the Japanese ships in what would be the Battle off Samar. And all that was standing in the way of this intimidating Japanese fleet was a ragtag group of U.S. ships, including the Johnston under the command of Ernest Evans. Do you think you have what it takes to command a fleet of battleships? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Battle off Samar. It was the morning of October 25, 1944, near Samar, when a Taffy 3, a U.S. Navy escort carrier group, noticed anti-aircraft fire in the distance. The Japanese had successfully diverted a main U.S. fleet from the region. However, Taffy 3 wasn't the kind of group to engage with a massive Japanese fleet. Aircraft had encountered the Yamato and their massive armada in the Leyte Gulf near the island of Samar, the 3rd largest in the Philippines. Enemy presence was news to Taffy 3 because they were under the impression that the area was clear of enemy ships. It's rumored that some commanders dismissed the initial reports as mistakes made by U.S. pilots patrolling the region. They believed the pilots mistook U.S. ships as enemy ships. Taffy 3 consisted of the Johnston, 6 jeep carriers, a few destroyers, and a few destroyer escorts. Ernest Evans knew he was outmatched. He understood that the Japanese fleet could easily bombard the soldiers that had made it to Leyte. Evans knew that he had to confront the enemy. He couldn't run away from this battle. If the Japanese were to advance past the Taffy 3, then the U.S. troops that had landed on the Philippines would be in danger of massive bombardments. And this encounter would be known as the Battle off Samar. The U.S. fleet didn't have the firepower or armor for a full-on battle. However, Evans had an advantage with technology. Fire control systems on ships like the Johnston allowed them to fire with greater accuracy than their enemy. So Evans decided to send the Johnston toward the Japanese in a zigzag pattern. It's reported that he said the following to his crew: "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected." Evans knew if he was close enough, he could launch 2 torpedoes. But he also had another plan. He created a smoke screen using the Johnston. It would make it difficult for guns on Japanese ships to be effective. Evans then ordered torpedoes to be fired, and they damaged an enemy cruiser. He also ordered his guns to be fired at the enemy. He gave them everything he had, knowing the Japanese were far more powerful. The Johnston's gunnery officer later recalled, "We felt like little David without a slingshot." Evans ordered the Johnston to move back so they could hide in the smokescreen. But the Japanese fleet fired upon the ship, causing immediate damage. As a result, one of the vessel's 2 engines was lost. So, Evans pulled his ship back into a squall, or violent windstorm, to regroup. They had 15 minutes before the enemy would attack again, and the squall was like a smokescreen because the storm would make enemy gunfire ineffective. For 3 hours, Evans led the Johnston in a valiant fight against the Japanese. Damage to the Johnston was extensive, but Evans still ordered the ship to fight. The Johnston had lost its secondary steering mechanism, as well as its communication lines to engineering and the bridge. The only way he was able to communicate was through an open hatch where he screamed orders. The situation was frantic, but Evans wasn't shaken in the slightest. It's said that Evans had his shirt blown off during the battle, and he lost 2 fingers in the process. The crew fought with bravery and ferocity. But the repeated hits from the Japanese resulted in the loss of power to all 3 of the ship's 5-inch, 13-centimeter guns, and rendered the Johnston's gyro compass completely useless. The USS Howell was also involved in this battle. Howell was a destroyer, and it fired torpedoes at the Japanese fleet as well. This tactic did cause confusion among the enemy as their ships frantically maneuvered from the torpedoes, which halted their attack. However, when the Japanese regrouped, they opened fire on the Howell, and unfortunately, it too took heavy damage during the battle while on a zigzag course. The Japanese continued their attack by firing torpedoes toward the US fleet. The ships fought in such a manner that Admiral Takeo Kurita, the commander of the Japanese fleet, was convinced he was up against a superior naval force. During the battle, the Johnston suffered extensive damage, leaving Evans with no choice but to abandon ship. The Johnston then rolled over, and as the vessel sank into the ocean, the captain of a nearby Japanese destroyer saluted the crew of the Johnston. Of the 327 men on board, an estimated 186 died, including Evans. 3 other U.S. ships sank that day. But somehow, the bravery of Taffy 3 stopped the advancement of the massive Japanese fleet. In his book, The History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, historian Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison said that no other engagement in the entire history of the U.S. has the country's Navy shown more guts, gallantry, and gumption than in the Battle off Samar. Sam Evans, head of the Naval History and Heritage Command, discussed the Battle off Samar and the legacy of Ernest Evans with an Oklahoma newspaper. He said, "This key battle in the Pacific War was almost a disaster for the United States." And he goes on to say that if it hadn't been for the actions of Evans, the battle would have gone much worse. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. He was also the first person of Native American ancestry to earn this honor for the U.S. Navy. His citation basically says that despite facing heavy damage from the intense enemy barrage, he fearlessly and without hesitation joined fellow members of his group in providing fire support during subsequent torpedo attacks against the Japanese forces. Evans was praised for outstanding and outmaneuvering the enemy as he consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile Japanese fleet and U.S. carriers, despite the crippling loss of engine power. The USS Evans was named in his honor and was a destroyer escort. The vessel was in service for the U.S. Navy from 1955 until it was scrapped in 1968. The Yamato, on the other hand, was in service until it was sunk in April of 1945 during a fierce battle. The wreckage of the USS Johnston was discovered in 2019. It's considered to be one of the deepest shipwrecks at 21,180 feet. 6,460 meters. A submersible research vessel called the Petrel was sent down by an exploration team to examine the wreckage. They were able to identify the ship by its assigned number, which apparently is still visible. The pilot of the submersible explained to the BBC that the wreck is so deep that oxygen is scarce, and because of this, the ship has remained remarkably preserved, despite its encounters with the turbulent waters of an intense battle. Wreaths were placed in the ocean by the exploration team to honor those who lost their lives on the Johnston. Ernest Evans and his crew were part of a battle that's been overshadowed in World War II history. The odds were against them, but they put everything on the line for freedom. And the sacrifices made by our military and these men will never be forgotten. Do you have any other amazing military leaders you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.